Okay, welcome everybody. My name is REINIER from NOORT. I'm from the Netherlands originally, and I live in Norway now for almost 3 years. In the Netherlands, I started HEMA in 2005, and then from 2009 I started looking at rapier, and I started up my own group, the School voor Historische Schermkunsten, which means School for Historical Fencing Arts, where we study the style of fencing that Bruggius, a German fencing master who taught in the Netherlands, he wrote his book there in Dutch. That's what I've been working with from 2009 or 10 to here. When I moved to Norway, I left my club in the capable hands of some of my guys, and I joined the Vechtenclub Vrije Duelister in Oslo, which means the fencing club of the free duelists. I started ENSE at MENTE with Sword in Mind as sort of my own outlet for things I like to put out there. And today, this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Fabris fencing lineage, the manuscript in Dresden called C13, George Pasha, another fencing master, and how they all come together. That's what we're going to see today. A lot of this work I've done together with my friend Jan Schaefer at the Schweetspiel Dresden. So, if Daniel can click. This is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start very briefly about Salvator Fabris, a little bit of information about his life, and then we're going to build up what we know about his lineage, his students, and their students. So let's see how much we can find there, and his heritage through that. Then we'll look at the manuscript C13, which is a very interesting manuscript, and I'll briefly describe some of the contents. We look at comparing it to another manuscript that's held in the British Library, which is called MS 17533. Based on that comparison, we'll draw some conclusions, and we see how George Pasha fits into this all. And how did Pasha learn the lessons of Fabris? Yeah? So, Fabris, that's him. So he was born in Padua in 1544. He died also in Padua in 1618. So he came to Denmark late 16th century. He taught to another Danish noble. Then he moved to the court of Christian IV, the king in Denmark. And he taught fencing there for a few years. Click. Then in 1606 he published his treatise Lo Schermo, which is one of the most important rapier fencing treatises we have today. A lot of people focus on Capoferro, Giganti. I think this one is better, but you know, personal. But I think I have a friendly crowd here on this opinion today. And in addition to this, there's also a few manuscript versions of his text around. Yeah. Then in 1606, after he published this book dedicated to the king, he asked the king, "Can I please go back to Padua for a bit?" And he got permission, so he traveled back via Paris. Click. Went to Padua, and basically he never returned, even if it's not entirely clear if he made that clear to the king that he was going to stay away or whether he suggested coming back. And what I really want to put out there is that he is the originator of the longest documented German fencing lineage. So all the people talking about Lichtenauer as the main fencing master in Germany. So we'll briefly go into that. That's not something that I came up with. It's something that Alex Kiermaier pointed out to me, and I'm just running with it now. So everybody in Germany basically knows this, and then they laugh at all the other people for not knowing it. If you want to do German fencing, Fabris. Okay, click. Here's just putting this in there. This is an illustration from one of the Fabris manuscripts. This one is in the Royal Library in The Hague. Lichtenauer recently purchased scans. Before that, I only had a set of photographs with poor lighting that I took. So now I can have these beautiful scans where you can see the real skin color rather than some orangey color from the poor lighting. And these illustrations are just beautiful. And what's striking to me is that they all have blonde hair. You don't expect that in an Italian treatise. But this manuscript is in Italian. Transcription of it is on my website, but that's not much interesting because we have Tom Leoni's translation of the main book. Yep. So let's start building this lineage of Salvator Fabris. So we have Salvator. Unfortunately, we have no idea where he learned his fencing, or from whom he learned his fencing. So we can't put anything above him there. He learned fencing. There's a little bit of mention of Salvator Fabris in Saint Didier's treatise. He mentions that at some point an Italian named Fabris came to his house and talked about fencing. You know, it's nice to think that it might be Salvatore, but there's no proof of that. Timing is more or less correct though. We click again. So let's start building up this bracket. A lot of information here comes from the, so in 1679 or 7, Johann Joachim Henrich published a German translation of Fabris's manual, or part of Fabris's manual. And in that, he has an introduction where he mentions a lot about the students of Fabris, names and what they did. And one of the names he mentions is Signor Hermann. And after Fabris's death in 1618, it was Signor Hermann, his foremost student, who took over Fabris's saal. But unfortunately, a few months later, another German called Henrich, who was related to Fabris, got jealous and apparently killed, murdered poor Hermann. Not that it gained him much, because then Henrich had to flee because he couldn't take over the saal after murdering his competition. So he fled, and Henrich does mention that he talked to some cavaliers years later who claimed to have been taught by this Henrich. So apparently Henrich fled to Germany and he did teach some fencing somewhere. Yeah. So then the next is Hans Wilhelm Schöffer von Dietz. This is a famous name. This is a guy who wrote some books himself and published some books. So he is another guy that Henrich is not that positive about. So he's like, well, there's this Hans Wilhelm Schöffer von Dietz. He claims to be a student of Fabris, but actually he was just a Vorfechter, Prevost. And he, according to Henrich, never learned from the master himself, but only fenced a bit in the saal. And the other complaint that Henrich then tells him, like, and he wrote this book, and it's big, but it doesn't have any structure to it. So he claims that Hans Wilhelm didn't actually understand fencing, but just presented a whole bunch of lessons to sort out, and often in the wrong order and without understanding the tempo properly, Henrich says. Well, if you look at Hans Wilhelm Schöffer von Dietz's book, you'll find a huge treatise with a lot of lessons running in the 800s or so, and that's about it. So every now and then people come up and like, can you translate that book for me? And I, no. No. I have a life. Yeah? So here we see this book, just one illustration from it I picked up. So you see it does show a Fabris-like stance, forward-leaning, extended arm, nice rapier there. Somebody wants to sponsor some work, but yeah. So then the next person mentioned by Henrich is Sebastian Häusler. That's another well-known name. He's another person who published fencing books, and he's, according to Henrich, was a student of Hans Wilhelm. And he's basically accused of the same issues. Basically, if you click, he says, oh yeah, this Sebastian Häusler, student of him, likewise didn't understand and just presented a splatter of lessons. Yes?
Are there any good English translations of Häusler available? Because the Wittner one's not great.
Can you go back? Yeah. Kevin, no, I mean yes, that's Liza to look at. Kevin Maurer translated parts of Häusler.
Yes, he did, but
I'm not sure.
There's whole chunks of it missing.
Yeah.
Stuff, so.
I think
anyone else working on it?
I've translated a small piece.
Okay.
Other than that, I don't think there is any. So I've translated, it's quite actually an interesting bit in his treatise. He has a section, the second section, which is titled something like, these are lessons to use in a time of great need. So basically saying, oh yeah, the rest is fencing. This is what you do if you're attacked in the street. And it's a bit different, a bit wilder, a bit more grapple. And a lot of the time just, grabbing blade or hilt and stabbing the other person several times, kind of stuff. So it's an interesting little bit. I did translate that. Häusler, it's likewise quite a big book, quite a lot of lessons, but not quite as big as Schöffer. Oh, come in. So who knows? Maybe we'll have a good translation at some point. Yeah. Now another interesting person here in this lineage. Come in, come in. So what I forgot to mention earlier is Hans Wilhelm Schöffer von Dietz. He's also known as having taught at the fencing academy in Søre. So Søre is a town in Denmark, and the Danish king created a school there for noble kids, and academy, Ritter Academy, and Hans Wilhelm Schöffer von Dietz was the fencing master there for some time. And then that brings us to the next name here is G.A. Well-known name for having written the Pallas Armata, one of the few English language rapey treatises published in 1630 something. And a few years ago, I think it was Jan Schaefer actually, he found a Danish language treatise in one of the German libraries, also written by this G.A. And it turned out to be, based on the structure, the same book as the Pallas Armata, but in Danish. Now, it's long not been known who this G.A. is, but in the Danish book, he refers to a bunch of, he dedicated to a bunch of Danish important people. And based on this info that he might actually have been a Danish person, then Klaus Sørensen, thank you. Klaus Sørensen derived that G.A. might actually be Gabriel Knudsen Akkeleje. And in his treatise, if you click on it here, but you don't read Danish, so if you click again, he says that amongst others, the widely famed, renowned and foremost master in this art while he lived, Hans Willem Schuffer, formerly appointed fencing master at the Royal Mobile Academy in Zurich, has written a large and verbose, there you go again, treatise about the art of fencing, which I have epitomized and edited into a better method, adding my own thoughts here and there, etc. So there's already a little bit of seeing a lineage, seeing somebody say like, hey, there's this master, I take his work, I'm his student, maybe, but I can do better. So that's a nice little bit there. And this is definitely a book that's worth looking into at some point. Yep. So, up to here, we've had Signor Hermann and Henrich, about whom Henrich did not have that much to say. And then we had Hans Willem Schuffer and Sebastian, that Henrich did talk about, but not very positively. But then he moves on to some names that he is a bit more positive about. He mentions Hans Wolf von Mulsheim, but he doesn't say much about this person. He just says that it's another student of Fabris teaching in Germany. If we then click again, we again have something about Søro here, because Hans Willem Schuffer, he taught in Søro. Then there was another fencing master, I forgot the name, I'm sorry. And after that there was a Hans Willem Eller coming from Mulsheim, teaching at Søro. So we don't know who this Hans Willem Eller, who his master was, but as he's from Mulsheim and as he's teaching in Søro, it's not unlikely that he was another person in the Fabrician lineage and then a student of Hans Wolf, maybe. If we then click again. And that's sort of interesting because there's an anonymous manuscript, code Guelph 26423, which is written by a student who wrote down, these are the fencing lessons that I received while I was a student in Søro. Can you click again? This manuscript. And the translation for this manuscript is out on Roar, on Roger Noeling's site. And he mentions his fencing master, Hans Willem. So at first, Jan Schaefer and I like, oh, Hans Willem, Søro, that must be Hans Willem Schuffer. But then Klaus Sørensen broke our dream and pointed out that Schuffer wasn't teaching by that time. So more likely, this refers to Hans Willem Eller, placing this as a student of him. Yep. So you see, we've already built up quite a lineage here. There's quite a lot of people we can, either with certainty, where we have the straight lines, or the dotted lines with some uncertainty, correlate to Fabris. Now, I made a strong claim about Fabris, him being the most important German lineage, and that goes through Wilhelm Kreuzler, another student of Fabris. And when Henrich wrote his translation, he's basically sucking up to Wilhelm Kreuzler and his family, saying like, and then there's the Kreuzlers who are teaching in Jena and some other places, and I really hope that they can find my work useful and good, and they can agree with it, because they are, the greatest, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? Now, if I really want to substantiate my claim, I should go into the whole Kreuzler lineage, but that's basically a whole presentation by itself, and there's some people working on that. So I'll just keep it to here. We have the Kreuzler dynasty. So a few of the Kreuzler, Wilhelm's sons spread out, Jena and some other towns started teaching there. Then they unfortunately never wrote a treatise, but then we have Anton Friedrich Kahn in 1730 something. He writes a treatise in the Kreuzler lineage. It's the first one we have. Then from there we have the Roux dynasty, another family of fencing masters by the name of Roux, also again Jena and the towns around there. And then eventually, eventually we get Friedrich Seemann Kahne, who was active until 1945. So then, looking into there, the earliest mention where we have Fabris as a fencing master around 1600, up to Seemann Kahne in 1945 gives you a lineage of 350 years. Earliest we have Fabris is 1389. Earliest we have Lichtenauer, 1389 as far as I know. Latest mention of Lichtenauer is Joachim Meyer, 1571. So there we have 132 years. Did I do that correctly? 13, no. Yeah, 100 and, no, not 30. Well, less than 200 years. There we go. So, yeah, clear winner, Fabris. Hey. Woohoo. Okay. And then the final name that Henrich gives is Heinrich von und zu Velde, though the name is spelled differently sometimes. And that was his own master. And if you click again, there we have him. So Henrich never included his own portrait in his treatise of Fabris, but he did include this portrait of his master, Heinrich, and gave some information on there. So based on the dates on this portrait, he was likely born around 28 May 1585. And based on some more biographical research that Jan and I did, he probably was born on the island of Rügen, which is on the north side of Germany. Germany only has a little bit of coast. This is east of Denmark. It's an island. It's still quite popular now with German tourists who go there. That's probably where he was born, because his family had the town of Velde. They were the mayors there and stuff. And then he died in Leipzig in 1662. And this reminds me, I should put a map somewhere on this presentation next time I give it, because you can see how this all moves and how it concentrates. It's actually a good point to myself. Yeah? So Heinrich came to Magdeburg, another town in central Germany, and there he worked at the Stift. So that's a school associated with the Protestant church, a church school. And he worked there, he taught there, probably as a fencing master as well. And he got there in 1621. And then, yeah. And then the next thing we find of him is a document saying that he returned to the Magdeburg Stift in 1637. And based on some calculations, it says in there that he worked at the Stift for so many years when he died. He must have left around 1627. So somewhere in 1630, around 1630, Magdeburg was sacked by the Catholic armies. So it may be that he fled for that happening. But also his older brother, he was a second son. His older brother died around that time as well. So he may have been called back home to fix that, to work with that. So there's some possible reasons why he had to disappear for a while. But yeah, 1637 he comes back, and then he's there until he dies. And the other thing that Henrich tells us is that his master Heinrich wrote a text about the art of fencing by Fabris. And that this text, I think I put that on text as well. Can you click? That in this text, he praised and quoted Salvator Fabris and Signor Hermann in both his oral and his written instruction. Yeah. So that suggests that Signor Hermann might have also been teaching Heinrich, so that he was not just Salvator's student, but also Hermann's student there. So, just go back one, please. The other way. Yeah. So there we have quite a splatter of names, quite a lot of names here that we can associate with Salvator Fabris. So I think it's quite interesting how much we can find about this lineage. I mean, if you look at other masters, other people, it's never that much that we can find. Okay. So, having gone through all that, I want to look at the two manuscripts that we're talking about. So this all started when Jan suggested we should have the manuscript in Dresden, the C13, scanned and looked at. So we put some money together, we had it scanned. We hoped to keep it secret for a while, but only a few days after we had it scanned, I got a message from Michael Chillister saying, "Oh, have you seen this manuscript scans they put online?" And he'd already shared it on Lichtenauer, and I'm like, Yeah, I've seen it. I paid for it. So, you know, before we could even finish our work on it, it was already out there. We'd hoped to have a good jump on the competition, but alas. So currently my translation of C13 that I did together with Jan is with Keith Farrell of Fallen Rook, and we hope to have it published later this year, but it all depends a bit on how much time Keith can find. But as we were working on this, we also found another manuscript. Well, we didn't find it, it was known, but nobody had seen it. In the British Library, additional manuscript 17533. And we were looking at this, and there was some overlap in titles. And we were also talking to two people in Austria, Florian Schattner and Julian. Julian is Schattner, Florian is another name. Well, and we were also talking, and they were transcribing C13, and people call me a machine, but they were going faster than Jan and I could go, so they finished their transcription before we could. But fortunately for us, they never wanted to make a translation, so that's good. But as we were discussing this, I also dropped to them, like, there's this other manuscript in the British Library that might be interesting. And then they went, which is scans and friendly enough shared them with me, so I have these scans, and that allows us to make this work. So that's very nice of them, and I should put their names on there to say thank you. So this manuscript, yeah. One of the nicer things, it includes illustrations, which is always good. And again, you see quite the same sort of postures. Yeah. So it's held by the British Library. It contains copies of several German manuscripts. So I think it's like 7 or so sections. It has this treatise on fencing. It has a brief version of the treatise on fencing. It starts with a collection of lessons. It has twice a very short text, only a few pages, explaining Thibaut's circle. And it has, very interesting, and I need to look more at that, a manuscript version of Henning's Hiebvechten treatise, though it never mentions Henning, where it almost has the same structure, but there's discrepancies. There's lessons missing, there's lessons added, so it's not exactly the same. So that's one of the next things I want to look at when I find some time, is a comparison of Henning, the printed Henning from Königsberg, and this Henning manuscript included in this treatise. Yeah. And there's the interesting part. At least one part is authored by H.A.V. You can actually see it here, H.A.V. So he says these are the lessons of. Wait, I have this. So here we have written information of Signor Salvatore's and other important fencing masters in Italy, brought together and ordered properly by H.A.V. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. So if you go through the manuscript, these are the names mentioned. We have a Sig Salvatore, a Sig Hermann, we have Thibaut, and we have Sig Moman. And actually the Sig Moman is what set us off to connecting it with C13, because in C13 there's also a Sig Moman. And then I searched the internet for Moman, and the only reference on any moments that I could find was this manuscript. So like, okay, we need to know what's in there. We have not found any information still about Sig Moman. It's only both the C13 and this one also have a section on caminere, which is the proceeding with resolution, the andare di risoluzione. And there it's said by Salvatore and Sig Moman in both. My suspicion is that this Moman might be a copyist error, that it was Signor Hermann that was miscopied into Moman and then copied and copied and copied. That's my best theory. But it might be a master that we've never heard of. It's also possible. Yep. So yeah, okay, next. So this is the main text. It presents fencing with a single rapier. So the whole manuscript, all of them are just single sword. And it says that as taught by Signor Salvatore, which must be Fabris, okay. It was written by H.A.V. Yeah, I think I've already done this bit. Go on. Yeah, in the text, there's sometimes references. So it explains something, and then between brackets, it just says Salvatore or Signor Hermann. So it refers to Salvatore and it refers to Hermann. Yeah. And because of that, if you remember, we had that the Henrich von Untenfelde had written a manuscript which, according to Henrich, he referred to Salvatore and Signor Hermann in his written and oral instruction. So if you look at that, this is a written instruction of Salvatore's fencing, which refers to Hermann and Salvatore several times. So it exactly fits the description that we have from Henrich for the text written by his master Henrich. So the theory that Jan and I hold, and I truly believe this, is that this HAV refers to Henrich Velde, and what the A is exactly, that's the, if I can, find what the A is, then I think we have it. Yeah. Yeah, so again, this is the lineage we have, yeah. Now, because of his words, we know that Johann Joachim Henrich was a student of Henrich, so there's another addition there to our Fabris lineage, yeah. But then we come to manuscript Dresden C13. So die eigentliche Beschreibung der Stoßfechten in einfachen Rapier, kürzlichen aus dem berühmten Signor Salvatore und anderen vornehmen Fechtmeistern zusammengetragen und in eine richtige Ordnung gebracht. So this is the clear description of thrust fencing with a single rapier, shortly, concisely, from the famous Signor Salvatore and other important foremost fencing masters brought together and brought into a correct ordering. So the same title, more or less, as we see in 17533, but it doesn't mention HAV. Somebody decided not to mention the actual author of this text. Yep. So the next thing we know is this manuscript has a dedication to Duke August, which is dated to 26 June 1671. Yeah, sorry. And the valediction, so the whole manuscript is in one hand, and also the dedication is in one hand, but the valediction underneath the dedication, like your servant, blah, blah, is written in different handwriting. So this, and it's signed with autograph by Johann George Pasha. So most likely there was a scribe hired to write down the work in a good, clear hand, and then Pasha just came in, signed off to finish it. Yep. And throughout the text we see mentions of Zudenfelde. This name is mentioned in the dedication. Signor Salvatore, Signor Moman, Signor Hermann, and Thibaut. Yep. So this is a bit of a quote from the dedication, and this is like such a really interesting bit. So what Pasha says here, so the book is signed by Pasha, like I said, is I have added my fencing lessons, which I learned blah, 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 not to be found amongst the lessons of Zudenfelde, and in particular the parrying, because in his lessons he has put very little about parrying, but only about contratempo, as well as holds and other lessons and guards that he did not have. So I put them there where they belong to make a complete fencing book. So what Pasha is actually saying here is like, yeah, the style of Fabris is very nice, but there's some stuff missing. It's not as good as it should be. I can do better. So it's like nice and arrogant. He's saying Pasha, the supreme master, but yeah, I can do better. But what it also shows is he points out exactly, this is the lessons that I come from before me, and this is how I'm going to change it. So we see very explicitly here how a lineage changes, how a style evolves. And I mean, yes, Italian rapier is focused on contratempo, not on parry riposte, but on just a direct counter. But then as fencing continues and as fencing evolves, the swords become a bit lighter, eventually also shorter into the small sword, and we see more parrying riposte actions come in because swords start to move faster compared to the bodies that don't change as much. So yes, you need parries at some point, but here we can just see it happening. And I think that's a really, really bit of fascinating information. And it's not just that he says that, because if Daniel clicks there, so this is the contents. So the first part in this book is the theoretical treatise. Then we have a part where it's just fighting lessons with, if you do this and the opponent does that, then you can do this, but if he does that, you do that, etc. Then we have a section on the Caminere mit der Resolution. So as I said, that's the andare di risolution, the proceeding which is said to be written by Signor Salvatore and Signor Moman. And then we have this short text about Thibaut's Vechtcirkel. Also interesting, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. So all these parts are found in 17533 as well. Yep. They are nearly identical. In C13, there's a few lessons missing. So there's especially at the end, so it's all thrust fencing, but at the end, 17533 gives some cuts and some mixing of thrusts and cuts. And there, C13 leaves out a bit, leaves especially the mixing thrust and cuts he leaves out, and the cuts as well, because cuts become less important. C13 doesn't have the figures that 17533 has, but it does have the figure references, and where in 17533 the numbers in the references are often left out, C13 includes the numbers, and they line up with the 17533 numbers, as far as I could tell, yeah? But then if you look at the first part, chapter 5, and the second part, the Vechtlektiones, chapter 11, we see that there's extra text added there compared to 17533, focusing exactly on the parries and the holds. So we can see exactly this is what Pasha injected into this existing treatise. This is what he added, and it lines up exactly what he said that he would add. So that's like, yeah, you really see this. This is the change in the lineage. This is where the style evolves. Yeah. Also, these changes are having this nearly identical texts, but with some lessons missing in C13 and some other things missing in 17533. That points that there's maybe a common source that both manuscripts were copied of, but we can't say that one is copied of the other, because there's things left out in either direction. So, yeah, likely there was a common source. Hopefully we'll find it sometime. But then the next question we need to ask is, how did Pasha gain access to this source? Can we find out how Pasha got this? Yeah? So here we have Johann George Pasha. He looks like a very pleasant man. I'd love to time. And we'll just look a little bit at his life and see how he may have received this manuscript. So yeah. So Pasha was born in Dresden. We don't know exactly when. And he died in September 1628 in Magdeburg. Oh, sorry, he was born in Dresden in 1628. He died in Magdeburg in 1678. And he was almost 50 years old. So he was not very old when he died. But he did have a nice job. Part of the time he worked as a hofmeister at a school for young nobles. So there you see it again, like one of those schools in Halle, which is around that same area. And in his time, he published numerous treatises on, he served Duke Augustus, I mentioned that name. He served numerous treatises on fencing with a thrust, fencing with a cut, on wrestling, on Jägerstock, which is a wooden staff, on the pick, on muskets, on how to drill regiments armed with muskets, and also on things like cutting and serving meat. So all the stuff a young boy needs to learn, Pasha wrote a book on it. And then, you know, he kept republishing his text, maybe changing them a bit, maybe just keeping them the same, different title, publish it again. Very good model. Yeah. If you look further, what he says, like, he says, I have improved the lessons I got, in particular, I've learned more, I've improved myself. So he says, like, I learned fencing some time ago, and I've been teaching this, but I have not been sitting still. I learned another style of fencing, namely that of Salvatore, and I got this from a good friend. So he got these lessons from a good friend, and this good friend has learned it from the noble and famous Zudemvelde. Okay, does that ring a bell? Maybe. And Zudemvelde himself had got them in Italy from Salvatore, so he reaffirms that Velde was a student of Salvatore. Well, there we go. Henrich, noble lord vernoemd zum Velde, my former and never sufficiently praised teacher. Interesting. Okay. So, Pasha, Henrich. Pasha learned it from a student of Velde. Henrich was a student of Velde. Could be. Furthermore, Pasha was working in Halle, and Henrich was working in Leipzig. These cities are not far apart. It's 30, 50 kilometers, something like that. So, and they were doing the same kind of thing. They were on the same line of work. So it's very likely that these two people knew each other. In addition to this, sometime after Pasha died, we see another Pasha, dancing master, marry a daughter of Henrich, if I remember correctly. So there's some family connection there, probably. So yeah, based on this, we think that Pasha and Henrich knew each other. Henrich at some point said, oh, hey, you should learn these lessons, gave him a manuscript. And Pasha's like, yeah, this is interesting. How can I make money of this? It's not perfect. I can, I'll improve it and give it to my master. Yeah. So, Pasha got the lessons from Henrich. And that means that Pasha, at least in this lineage, could be seen as a student or follower of Henrich, putting him in Fabris's lineage, right there. So this was mainly the main message I wanted to bring you people. Just show that lineage, show how Pasha fits in there. But really, for me, the most interesting thing to see here is to have another text that describes Fabris's style of fencing, to have that at a later point in Germany and in German, and to actually see that it changes, to have these two versions with these clear changes, these clear additions, and not just that, but to see that there was a conscious choice by the copyist or the person ordering the copy to say, I'm going to change this text because I can make it better. Showing us this is how a fencing lineage can change. This is evolution in motion.
Do you have something that shows like the timeline on these things? I get that it's probably in the 1600s that
The timeline of
when the changes were. I'm guessing not getting.
So Fabris died in 1618. Herman died a few months after Fabris, so 1618, 1619. When these other people studied with Fabris, not clear. I think on some of them it mentions learn in Italy. I think it says that Henrich von Zumfelde learned these lessons in Italy. So that suggests after 1606, before 1618, because that's when he went to Italy, when Fabris was back in Italy. Henrich, when exactly he learned, not clear. Might have been before he came to Magdeburg in, what was it, 1621. So he may have learned that before then, but not clear. Pasha signs off on the manuscript in 1671. So a few years before that, he must have started looking at it maybe, 1 or 2 years, and then made these changes.
Does Salvator Fabris have a lineage that survived in Italy in Italian manuscripts? Or is it just outside of your purview as a scholar?
I have never found any indication of such.
That's really interesting.
There is mention of Fabris still in later manuscripts, books, published books. Marcelli might mention him. I'm pretty sure 1630s. Alfieri, thank you. He mentions Salvatore. I think Marcelli mentions Salvatore.
But they wouldn't be students in a lineage as such.
No, they don't mention him as their master. In Sicily, we have the Sicilian master who wrote a book in 1670 something, and another one a few years later. Sorry, I can't find the name. There's another one that mentions Fabris. So he's being mentioned, often positively, or at least positively, and then they say something bad about it. But there's nobody saying he was my master or my master's master or whatever. So maybe there are treatises that people haven't put online, because Italian people are not as sharing in English as some other people. But I don't know of any. It would be very interesting.
It's interesting that, like, arguably the greatest Italian manuscript of the early 1600s, oh, I just started drama there, created a German lineage. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, he was teaching a lot in Germany. So there's a few more people that we can sort of associate with Fabris. One of them is Bruggius. I mentioned this name at the beginning. in his introduction, he writes that he knows Fabris published a treatise, and the style of fencing that he shows fits in with a lot of what we see in these books that we have. But I haven't found any direct connection of him to Fabris. Another one is Joachim Köppe. If you push the button, there we have the name, Joachim Köppe. So it's not a Johan, that's Henrich. I always make that mistake. Yeah, if you push it again, this guy, push it again, or that guy, and again. Yes, so there we go. So he's this is a very interesting character. He was a medical doctor in Magdeburg, and in 1619 he published a treatise on fencing. And he's not a fencing master. He never says that he's a fencing master. He doesn't seem to be a fencing master, but he chose to publish a treatise on fencing anyway. Really nice thing is that he's the archetypal absent-minded professor. He'll shoot off on any direction at any time. So it's a huge blundering text. It's not the most interesting text to learn fencing from, though he does describe some things differently in an annoyingly different way from the works around him. That you're like, is he now saying the same thing as all the other people, or is he actually saying something different? Does he understand what he's saying? But it's a really fun little, very interesting work as a historical document. If you click again, and so this is the title of the work, and he mentions that even though I have, just click again because I put it there. Yeah, even though I may have learned from and increased my art, improved my art with this book, which I've received from him himself in Paris. So he's stating in this bit like, oh, people may accuse me of having copied Fabris's work, but you know, I got my book, I met him in Paris, he probably got it signed. Even though I got the book from him himself, I have not copied it. You'll see if you compare them side by side that my work is different. I have written it myself. And then he says some stuff about how bad people are who plagiarize. But now there's a few, as I said, his way of describing things is interesting and different. And we see Bruggius sometimes having some of the same stuff in there. So Bruggius never mentions Köppe, but he must have known his work. Because Köppe, in one of the introduction sections, he says, what is fencing and how are several things the same? And Bruggius has the exact same section title with more or less the same text following it. Köppe lines out, like, I'm going to write a treatise on this, 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 and this, and I never did it. Bruggius lines out, I'm going to write a treatise on this, 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 and never did it. Though Bruggius' list is shorter, so at least he promised less. And the other interesting thing is, like, Köppe has a quote to describe tempo, and Bruggius uses the same quote, and this is, they both go on about some people complain that they're never lucky, but it's all about tempo, because Lady Luck has nice locks at the front, but the back of her head is bald. So if you see her come by and then try to grasp, there's nothing to grab onto. And that's a nice little quote that they both use. So Bruggius, yeah, must have copied some stuff there. Let's click again. I don't know what I put on there anymore. Yes. Oh yeah, that's another really nice little quote. So Köppe has some quotes about Fabris, and this is like the original shit talking, the stuff that we hear now. You know, this is the typical keyboard warrior stuff. Like, oh, you can say that, but you can't do it in a real fight. And Fabris here. So Köppe talks about destreza, people fighting upright and using mathematics. And at some point he thinks it's from Amsterdam, which probably means that what he heard of is Thibaut. But of course, Thibaut brought it from Spain. And then he's like, but here I recall what the distinguished and widely famed Salvator Fabris, my buddy, what he let know in writing in 1609 in response to someone who cited and blathered to him about such lines and angles in Paris. So what Fabris said is like that he had never proceeded nor been zealous to learn to draw lines, circles, and angles, and he would readily admit to any clerk, baccalaureate, and mathematician that they could explain and present this better than he could, because his fencing was not performed on paper or a blackboard. It wasn't done with inks or chalks, but it was done in the arena and on the square with the weapons and swords. And even if he himself or his scholars might be prevailed upon and overcome by anyone by way of a demonstration of lines and angles, or even if anyone can show these lines and angles better, he still held the opinion that it would not be so easy to defeat him or to gain advantage on the square REINIER. So like the last bit is basically saying, you know, even if you can demonstrate it in a demonstration and you can beat me there, if we do it in a real fight, I'll still have you.
Nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed. 1609, 400 years ago, same stuff. Yeah, yeah. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for coming and hearing this. I have a workshop today about brugjes, so that's 1671 as well, fencing in the Netherlands, same lineage. Probably look at tempo and invitations. So you can, if you're interested, welcome to come by. Like I said, C13, the manuscript we talked about, I'm working on a translation. It's with my editor. Hopefully later this year we'll have it out. Kuppe, the book at the end there, another manuscript, another translation I'm working on is currently with Harold Rotter, who is doing the review for me. Again, I'd hope to have it out this year. I think it will be next year. So there's stuff coming if you're interested. So yeah, thank you.